Long Island, New York, 1989. A 27-year-old kid with no college degree, no Wall Street pedigree, and no legitimate financial credentials walked into a strip mall office park in Lake Success, New York, and started a brokerage firm. His seed capital was roughly $3,000. His first office was so small that two grown men could barely stand back to back inside it. His only assets were a telephone, a list of names, a script he'd written himself, and a voice that could make a con sound like a covenant. Within 5 years, that strip mall firm, Stratton Oakmont, had more than 1,000 brokers on the floor and was generating $50 million a month in commissions. Within 10 years, he was in federal prison. His name was Jordan Belfort, and what he built wasn't just a brokerage. It was the most brazen, most lucrative, most audacious fraud in the history of American retail investing. And you've seen the movie, but the movie barely told half of it. Jordan Ross Belfort was born on July 9, 1962, the son of Max and Leah Belfort, an accountant and a housewife from the Jewish middle class of New York City. There was nothing especially unusual about the Belfort household. No inherited wealth, no significant connections, no head start. What Jordan Belfort had was ambition, the raw, hungry, slightly desperate kind that tends to grow in people who are smart enough to see what they don't have. As a kid, he was bright, quick. He processed things faster than his classmates, and he noticed it. He went to American University in Washington, D.C., enrolled in biology, and briefly considered a career in dentistry. He enrolled at the University of Maryland School of Dentistry. He quit after 1 semester. His professor, in perhaps the most consequential single sentence in the history of financial fraud, told the incoming class, "Gentlemen, the golden age of dentistry is over. If you're here for the money, you are in the wrong place." Belfort took him at his word. He returned to Long Island with a biology degree, a wife, Denise Lombardo, his childhood sweetheart, and no clear plan. What he had instead was an instinct for selling. As a teenager, he had sold Italian ices on the beaches of Bayside with his best friend. The summer he was 16, they made $6,000. That wasn't a job. That was the beginning of an education. Jordan Belfort had discovered at 16 the thing that would define the rest of his life. He could sell. Before Wall Street, there was seafood. In the early 1980s, Belfort got into the meat and fish distribution business. He operated a route, delivering seafood door to door to homes and businesses across Long Island from a refrigerated truck. He was good at it. Good enough to expand the operation, hire drivers, grow it into something real. Then the business collapsed. His partner mismanaged the finances. The company went under, and Belfort found himself in his mid-20s, broke, and starting over. He did what any young man with no prospects and enormous ambition did in New York in 1987. He applied to become a stockbroker. He was hired at L.F. Rothschild, one of the oldest brokerage houses on Wall Street, as a trainee. He studied. He passed his Series 7 licensing examination on the first attempt. He sat on the trading floor and watched how the game was played. He was there for exactly 1 year. On October 19, 1987, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 508 points, 22.6% in a single trading session. The worst single-day percentage decline in market history. The event became known as Black Monday. L.F. Rothschild, like dozens of other Wall Street firms, could not survive it. The firm went bankrupt. Jordan Belfort was 25 years old, out of a job, and newly separated from the first version of his life. He was about to begin the second. Syosset, Long Island, 1987. When the marble halls of L.F. Rothschild closed behind him, Jordan Belfort didn't look uptown. He looked sideways. He found work at a small penny stock brokerage operation on Long Island, the kind of operation that didn't make the newspapers and didn't want to. These were the boiler rooms, offices crammed with phones and cheap suits, and salesmen screaming over each other, selling microcap stocks to retail investors across America. Penny stocks, shares of tiny obscure companies trading below $5, were not regulated by the same rules governing NYSE and NASDAQ-listed securities. The oversight was thin. The commissions were massive. And if you controlled enough of a company's stock before you started selling it, you could drive the price up through sheer sales pressure, then dump your own shares into the rising market before the retail investors you just called realized what had happened. This was called a pump and dump. It was, and is, illegal. Jordan Belfort learned the mechanics in about 6 months. He also noticed something about the existing operations. They were leaving enormous money on the table. The salesmen were mediocre. The scripts were weak. The targets were disorganized. Nobody had applied genuine sales sophistication to the fundamentals of the scheme. He began to understand that what he was watching wasn't a scam that needed better morals. It was a scam that needed better management. In 1989, Jordan Belfort joined a small, barely functioning brokerage called Stratton Securities. He brought with him a partner, Danny Porish, a cousin by marriage from Long Island who shared his ambitions but not his intellect. Belfort was the architect. Porish was the engine. They reorganized the firm. They renamed it Stratton Oakmont. They installed Belfort's methods. A floor of young salesmen, almost exclusively male, mostly with no college education, many recruited straight from neighborhoods in Queens and Brooklyn, trained on a single unified selling script that Belfort himself had written and perfected. The script was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. It combined urgency, authority, scarcity, and flattery in a sequence that had been tested and refined until it worked on virtually anyone who stayed on the phone long enough to hear it. Belfort didn't just teach people to sell. He taught them to perform, to transform themselves from ordinary young men into voices of absolute financial authority. He called it the straight line system. The target was always the same: wealthy, often older, retail investors, doctors, lawyers, business owners who had money to spend and enough financial sophistication to think they understood stocks, but not enough to see through what they were actually being sold. The commission on a Stratton Oakmont trade was not 5 or 6%, the industry standard. It was 50%. 50%. Half of every dollar invested went directly to Stratton Oakmont, and a significant portion went directly to Jordan Belfort. The machine was running, and it would not stop for years. By the early 1990s, Stratton Oakmont had exploded beyond anything its founders could have rationally planned. The floor had grown from a handful of desks to more than 1,000 brokers at its peak. Annual revenues climbed to over $50 million, then climbed again. Belfort was generating tens of millions of dollars in personal income per year. He moved from a modest Long Island home to an estate in Old Brookville, a gated compound with a pool, a tennis court, and a helicopter pad. He bought a 167-foot yacht, which he named the Naomi, after his daughter from his second marriage. He bought a Learjet. He owned a Ferrari. He owned a Lamborghini. He owned a collection of cars and a second home in the Hamptons. His second wife, Nadine Caridi, was a former model of extraordinary beauty whom he'd started calling the Duchess. She appeared in Miller Lite commercials. She was, by every outward measure, the trophy element of a life that was performing wealth as spectacle. The parties at Stratton Oakmont became legend, and then became something beyond legend. Entertainers hired for the trading floor. Exotic animals brought through the office. Cocaine openly consumed. Belfort himself has described walking across the trading floor mid-session and being unable to physically function from the quantity of narcotics in his system. The drug of choice was methaqualone, known generically as Quaaludes. The manufacturing of Quaaludes had been banned in the United States in 1984, but Belfort had found a supplier who was still obtaining pharmaceutical-grade product. He was consuming, at one point, dozens of pills per week. He was also managing a 1,000-person brokerage firm, running a criminal enterprise, and maintaining the performance of a legitimate Wall Street executive for regulators and clients alike. The dissonance was total. The money made it sustainable until it didn't. It is worth being precise about what Stratton Oakmont actually did, because the film version, while accurate in spirit, necessarily compressed and simplified the mechanics. The core operation was straightforward. Stratton Oakmont would take a company public through an IPO. These were not legitimate companies in any meaningful sense. They were, in many cases, shells. Entities with inflated valuations, thin or fabricated business models, and stock worth a fraction of the price being sold to retail investors. In the weeks before a public offering, Stratton Oakmont brokers would pre-sell the stock to their retail clients at a set price. What these clients didn't know was that the firm controlled, through hidden agreements and nominee accounts, enormous blocks of the same stock at prices far below the public offering price. When the IPO launched, Stratton Oakmont's 1,000-broker army would hit the phones. They would drive demand. They would push the price up, sometimes 200, 300, 400% above the offering price in a single day. At the peak of the frenzy, Stratton Oakmont would sell its controlled shares into the rising market. The retail investors were left holding stock that was now falling back toward its actual value, which was often close to zero. The victims were not anonymous. They were specific, named individuals, doctors who invested their savings, business owners who trusted a voice on the phone, retirees who believed in the promise of easy wealth. Over the lifetime of the scheme, Stratton Oakmont defrauded investors of an estimated $200 million. $200 million. Stolen in broad daylight over telephone wires by men in their 20s and 30s who were paid half of everything they took. Among the dozens of companies Stratton Oakmont brought to market, one became a defining chapter of the entire story: Steve Madden Limited. Steve Madden, the shoe designer whose brand still exists and still sells shoes in shopping centers across the world, was, in the early 1990s, a small independent designer trying to build a business. He was also a close personal associate of Jordan Belfort. In 1993, Stratton Oakmont took Steve Madden Limited public. The IPO raised significant capital, but hidden beneath the public transactions was a private arrangement. Belfort, through a network of nominees and offshore accounts, secretly controlled enormous quantities of Steve Madden stock. As Stratton brokers drove up the price, Belfort was positioned to profit on the back end without his name ever appearing in a public filing. This deal, in its use of offshore accounts, nominee buyers, and securities concealed behind complex structures, would eventually provide federal prosecutors with some of their most damaging evidence. It was also, despite everything, Steve Madden's genuine breakthrough moment. The company survived the fraud. The brand grew. Steve Madden went to prison. He served 41 months. Today, Steve Madden Limited generates more than $2 billion in annual revenue. The shoe company built on fraud outlasted the fraud. This is, in some lights, the most American sentence in this entire story. Stratton Oakmont was not operating in secret. The securities industry had been watching it with varying degrees of alarm for years. The National Association of Securities Dealers, the self-regulatory body for the brokerage industry, had been receiving complaints about Stratton's sales practices since the late 1980s. By 1992, regulators had suspended several of Stratton's brokers. By 1993, the New York Stock Exchange released a formal report on the firm identifying specific abuses. In 1994, the NASD filed a complaint that would eventually lead to Stratton Oakmont being formally expelled from the securities industry, a process that dragged through legal challenges for years. But the regulatory machinery moved slowly. And every time Stratton faced a formal action, Belfort's attorneys engaged the process. Fines were paid, Appeals were filed. Brokers were suspended individually while the firm continued operating. The firm was expelled. It reopened under a different name and continued. The machine was too profitable to stop from the outside. The only way to destroy Stratton Oakmont was from the inside. That process had already begun. The FBI's investigation into Stratton Oakmont was not triggered by a single dramatic event. It was the accumulation of complaints, investor complaints, industry reports, anonymous tips, that led federal agents to open a formal inquiry in the early 1990s. The SEC and the FBI worked in parallel, sometimes coordinating and sometimes not. Prosecutors began constructing a timeline of specific transactions: the IPOs, the nominee accounts, the offshore money flows, the capital that had moved to Switzerland through a network of shell companies Belfort had constructed with extraordinary care. A key element of that offshore operation was a Swiss bank account held in the name of a relative of Belfort's second wife, Nadine, specifically her aunt. Belfort, with the assistance of a European attorney named Jean-Jacques Sorel, had used this account structure to park millions of dollars offshore, entirely outside the view of American regulators. The Swiss account, the money laundering, the offshore nominee structures. These would form the core of the federal criminal case. But to crack them open, prosecutors needed something they didn't yet have. They needed someone on the inside to talk. The story of how Stratton Oakmont collapsed is, at its heart, a story about betrayal. The same betrayal that ends virtually every organized criminal enterprise. Danny Porish, Belfort's partner, the man who had run the floor, who had been at Belfort's side since the beginning, was separately targeted by federal prosecutors. When investigators presented him with the evidence they had accumulated, he cooperated. He provided information that helped prosecutors understand the internal structure of Stratton Oakmont's fraud. What happened next is disputed in its details. Belfort has said that he tried to protect his employees and associates, that he was the last to cooperate, not the first. Federal documents suggest a more complicated picture. What is documented? Jordan Belfort eventually agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. He agreed to wear a wire. He met with associates and attempted, with limited success, to extract incriminating conversations on tape. His usefulness as a cooperating witness was considered partial at best by prosecutors. He was charged with securities fraud and money laundering. The potential sentence, across all counts, was many decades in federal prison. He was 36 years old. His empire was gone. His wife was leaving him. His body was destroying itself through addiction. In 1999, he pleaded guilty. Before this documentary goes further into what happened to Jordan Belfort, it is worth stopping to ask a question that the movie, and Belfort himself, does not spend much time on. What happened to the investors? Stratton Oakmont defrauded approximately 1,500 named investors. The actual number of people who lost money was significantly larger. Many victims never came forward, never fully understood what had happened to them, or simply absorbed their losses and moved on. For those who did come forward, the experience was devastating in ways that don't translate well to cinema. A retired teacher who had invested her savings, a doctor who had been pitched on what sounded like a legitimate IPO, a small business owner who was led to believe he had been specifically selected for an exclusive deal. These were not sophisticated hedge fund investors who understood the risks. They were ordinary people who received phone calls from confident, authoritative voices, telling them they had been given rare access to something most people would never get. The script Jordan Belfort wrote, the straight line system, was not just a sales technique. It was a tool specifically engineered to exploit human psychology, the urgency, the flattery, the artificial scarcity, the performance of expertise. Every element had been calibrated to overcome the natural resistance of someone who knew, somewhere in the back of their mind, that something sounded too good to be true. They were right. It was. By the mid-1990s, The fabric of Jordan Belfort's personal life was disintegrating at the same rate as his professional one. His drug addiction, which had been a controlled performance of excess in the early Stratton years, had become genuinely uncontrollable. He was consuming Quaaludes, cocaine, marijuana, and prescription medications simultaneously. His behavior had become erratic in ways that were costing him even more than the legal exposure. The most famous single episode in his memoir, and in the Scorsese film, is the incident involving his Lamborghini Countach. Belfort, so heavily sedated on Quaaludes that he was operating in a near unconscious state, drove the car from his estate down a road he cannot remember, through hedges and across driveways, before arriving home to discover he had destroyed the vehicle and had no memory of the journey. The helicopter incident came around the same period. Belfort owned a helicopter and a pilot's license. Under the influence of drugs, he attempted to operate the helicopter himself on the grounds of his estate, resulting in a crash. He survived without serious physical injury. His marriage to Nadine was collapsing under the weight of his addiction and his legal exposure. She would eventually divorce him in 2005, and he would lose custody arrangements that had once seemed stable. Stratton Oakmont was formally shut down by regulators in 1996 after the NASD's expulsion order was upheld and the firm could no longer operate. Jordan Belfort was out of the securities business for good. The party was over. What came next was the reckoning. On September 4, 2003, Jordan Belfort was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $110.4 million in restitution to his victims. The judge applied a downward departure from sentencing guidelines in recognition of his cooperation with the government. Cooperation that, despite its limitations, had still produced actionable intelligence for prosecutors. He served 22 months at the Taft Correctional Institution, a minimum security federal facility in Kern County, California. He was released in April 2006. Those 22 months at Taft are, in a narrative sense, the quietest section of Belfort's life. He has described prison as the first extended period of his adulthood during which he was genuinely sober. He attended classes. He exercised. He began in the facility's limited library to write. What he was writing would become his memoir. He has also described befriending Tommy Chong, of Cheech and Chong, who was serving time at the same facility for selling drug paraphernalia online and who, according to Belfort, encouraged him to write the book. The fact that Jordan Belfort's transformation from convicted fraudster to best-selling memoirist was encouraged by a counterculture comedian serving time for bong sales is, frankly, the most perfectly American sentence in a story that is entirely composed of perfectly American things. The Wolf of Wall Street, Belfort's memoir, was published in September 2007. It detailed in explicit and frequently chaotic detail every element of the Stratton Oakmont story: the drugs, the parties, the fraud, the money, the excess. It was written with a manic energy that made it feel less like a confession and more like a celebration. Critics noted this. Several reviews pointed out that the memoir's narrator seemed to find his own crimes more entertaining than regrettable. Belfort had written a book that functioned simultaneously as a cautionary tale and as a lifestyle advertisement. It sold extraordinarily well. The film rights were acquired by Leonardo DiCaprio's production company before the book was even formally published. Martin Scorsese, one of the defining directors in American cinema, attached himself to the project. DiCaprio, who had wanted to play Belfort for years, finally got the role. The Wolf of Wall Street was released in December 2013. It was 3 hours long. It was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. It grossed $392 million worldwide on a budget of roughly $100 million. See, it also sparked one of the more interesting moral debates in recent Hollywood history. Was the film a condemnation of Belfort and the culture he represented, or was it an inadvertent glorification? The film's final scene, Belfort, standing on a stage in New Zealand, selling his motivational speaking techniques to an audience that is literally asked to sell him a pen, was Scorsese's answer to that question. The audience is us. The question is whether we understand that. Many people didn't understand that. Many still don't. After prison, Jordan Belfort reinvented himself as a motivational speaker and sales trainer. He offered seminars. He wrote books on sales technique. Way of the Wolf was published in 2017, and sold them to an audience of entrepreneurs, salespeople, and business professionals who found his story inspiring rather than cautionary. The pitch was clever, and it was almost certainly conscious. Jordan Belfort had not changed what he was selling. He had changed what he was selling it as. At Stratton Oakmont, he had sold worthless stocks by performing the role of a financial authority. As a motivational speaker, he sold personal development by performing the role of a reformed authority, a man who had been to the very bottom and come back, whose crimes were proof that the techniques he taught could transform anyone into a master of influence. The straight line system, the sales methodology he had developed to defraud investors, was now the intellectual property he was selling to business schools and sales teams worldwide. The same psychological tools, the same understanding of persuasion, repackaged as legitimate entrepreneurship. He charged speaking fees of up to $100,000 per appearance. He toured Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, South Africa. He became a fixture on the global conference circuit, where audiences paid hundreds of dollars to hear a convicted fraudster explain the psychology of sales. The irony was visible. Belfort made it the point. The story was the product. The most significant ongoing controversy in Jordan Belfort's post-prison life is not his speaking tour. It is his restitution payments. In 1999, Belfort was ordered to pay $110.4 million in restitution to the approximately 1,500 investors defrauded by Stratton Oakmont. The order required him to pay 50% of his net income toward restitution until the full amount was repaid. In 2013, 14 years after his sentencing, prosecutors revealed that Belfort had paid back approximately $11.6 million, roughly 10% of the total owed. Reports emerged that he was earning millions from his speaking career and from the film deal, while his restitution payments lagged dramatically behind his income. Federal prosecutors, including members of the original prosecution team, publicly stated that Belfort was not complying with the spirit of his restitution obligations. Members of Congress wrote letters to the Department of Justice. Journalists tracked the gap between his visible wealth and his disclosed payments. Belfort disputed these accounts and stated that he was paying what he was legally required to pay. His representatives argued that his income was lower than publicly reported. The victims, those 1,500 people whose savings were taken, were watching a man sell his own criminality as a brand, appear on the covers of magazines, and travel the world as a celebrity, while many of them had never recovered a single dollar of what they lost. As of the most recently available public figures, Belfort has repaid approximately $14 million of the $110.4 million owed. The timeline for full repayment, if it ever occurs, remains unclear. This is the part of the story that does not have a Hollywood ending. The release of Scorsese's film opened a wider cultural conversation about Jordan Belfort that has never fully closed. Christina McDowell, daughter of Tom Prusalis, a man who worked alongside Belfort at Stratton Oakmont and was himself convicted of securities fraud, published an open letter in January 2014 addressed to the cast and filmmakers of the movie. Her letter described growing up in a family destroyed by the culture the film was depicting. It described the specific human cost, not in abstract millions, but in a family that fell apart, a father who went to prison, a childhood reconstructed on the rubble of criminality. She wrote that the film was a reckless attempt at continuing to glorify and promote a destructive financial culture while not taking responsibility for the social and economic consequences of that glorification. The letter was widely shared. It was a reminder that behind the spectacle, the drugs, the yachts, the parties, the 3-hour Scorsese film were specific, named, real people who did not get a film deal and a speaking career. They got stolen savings and courtroom appearances and years of attempting to rebuild what someone took from them in exchange for a phone call and a script. The question of Jordan Belfort's redemption is contested, and it will remain contested. He has expressed remorse in interviews. He has talked about the damage he caused. He has, by his own account, rebuilt his life without returning to fraud. He has also built a significant media brand out of being the man who committed the fraud. Whether those two things can coexist is a question his victims answer very differently than he does. It is worth, at this point in the documentary, stepping back from the narrative and asking a question that the story itself doesn't always prompt. Why did it work? The straight line system was not magic. It was not uniquely brilliant. It was a codification of influence principles that psychology researchers had been describing for decades. The work of Robert Cialdini on influence and persuasion. The behavioral economics insights of Kahneman and Tversky. The basic human tendency to trust confident authority under conditions of uncertainty. What Belfort contributed was packaging. He took what researchers had described academically and turned it into a repeatable, teachable, scalable sales performance, one that could be delivered identically by a 22-year-old from Brooklyn who had never read a psychology textbook. The genius of the straight line system was that it made manipulation industrial. One broker using sophisticated psychology to influence one investor is a transaction. 1,000 brokers, uniformly trained, uniformly scripted, using sophisticated psychology on 100,000 investors simultaneously is a system. The system was the crime. The scripts were the weapons. The management of the floor, the energy, the competition, the culture of performance, was the mechanism that kept the system running at scale. What Belfort built at Stratton Oakmont was, in operational terms, not unlike what Ray Kroc built at McDonald's. A machine for delivering a consistent product at scale, using a workforce trained to execute a specific sequence of actions without deviation. The difference was what the product was. Jordan Belfort is currently in his early 60s. He splits his time between California and Australia. He continues to speak, consult, and write. He maintains a significant social media presence. He is, by outward appearances, comfortable. The 1,500 investors he defrauded are in various states of recovery and non-recovery. Some have rebuilt, some never did. The money Belfort was ordered to repay, $110.4 million, remains mostly unpaid. The story of Jordan Belfort is not, in the end, a story about one unusually greedy man. It is a story about a system. It is a story about a financial industry that created the conditions in which a man with $3,000, a telephone, and a psychology of persuasion could steal $200 million over a decade, largely in plain sight, while regulators moved slowly and clients wanted to believe. It is a story about a culture, specifically American, but not exclusively, that treats the performance of wealth as a form of achievement, that struggles to distinguish between someone who is genuinely good at something and someone who is good at performing the appearance of being good at something. It is also, uncomfortably, a story about us, the audience. We bought the book. We watched the film. We paid to hear him speak. We made him famous a second time for being famous the first time. We turned the fraud into entertainment and then debated in the same breath why nobody had stopped it sooner. The question at the end of the Jordan Belfort story is not whether he deserves redemption. That is between him, his victims, and whatever accounting system you believe in. The question is what we do with what his story shows us. That the machinery of persuasion is everywhere. That the performance of authority is often indistinguishable from authority itself. and that the people most likely to take your money are the ones who make you glad to give it. Belfort knew this at 25. He built a firm around it. The question is whether knowing it changes anything. If this documentary made you see the Wolf of Wall Street story differently, not as a spectacle but as a system, then we've done the job. The fraud wasn't just in the phones and the scripts and the offshore accounts. It was in the culture that celebrated the money before it asked where the money came from. Subscribe for more documentary deep dives into the people and systems that reshaped the financial world. We'll see you in the next one.